Hey everybody, it's Dr. Jensen and welcome to part 5. So we're moving away from law enforcement and now moving toward corrections. So we're still in module 4, but this last part of the module we're going to focus on corrections, which is chapter 7 in the Surratt text. So let's take a quick look. The text goes over a brief history of corrections in the media, and it's really important to note the contrast between corrections and law enforcement as well as the court. So, for example, corrections really has not been in the media spotlight as much as other steps in the criminal justice system. There is more focus on crime fighters and courts. They have more public access and they're more publicly available. And by law, you have to allow courts to have some kind of public access. So prior to the Enlightenment, jails and prisons in the correctional system were really just holding tanks for future punishment. And that future punishment usually was either torture of some kind, banishment, or very commonly death for many, many, many different offenses. And so this wasn't of much interest to the public to just look at the prison and jail itself. They were more interested in the punishment that happened after the brief stay in the prison and jail. That was much more public spectacle, like the hanging in the central square of the city, and there's lots of media coverage of that. But before the hanging, not much. So this also demonstrates a shift that we've experienced in society of jails and prisons as punishment in and of themselves, rather than the short stay you have before a more formal and often public punishment. So we do see, though, that over time, and Surratt brings this about in the textbook, incarceration rates have risen along with the evolution of media if we track it since about the 1830s. And earlier in the course we talk about why the 1830s, because we start doing mass distribution. But you need to be really careful about assuming causation. So yes, there is a correlation between an increase in media coverage and an increase in incarceration, but this doesn't mean they cause each other. This may be more that the trends are parallel, but they really don't have much to do with each other. We haven't found much evidence to support that. But it really has more to do with the changing penal system at the time and rapidly revolutionizing media also happening at the same time. So it has more to do with the history and the changing times of the country than them causing each other. So I want to bring your attention to box 7.1 in your textbook. This actually documents that change of the incarceration rate from 1830 to as late as 2012, where we look at jails, state and federal prisons, and it shows you that increase, and also identifies some of the more high-profile cases going on at the time that would have received a lot of media coverage. There are some notes below this box in 7.1 that are worth reading so you can better understand this relationship that Surratt discusses. Now, one huge barrier to prison being covered by the media is the closed access nature of prison. So again, courts by law are required to provide some sort of public access, even if it's just a sketch artist or transcripts of the trial or whatnot. There is some sort of public access. Correctional institutions, on the other hand, are designed to be closed to the public with heavy restrictions, mostly citing security as a concern to keeping people out. So even things like crises, such as riots, deaths of inmates, and escapes, are much less of a media spectacle because of a lack of access provided by the prison. And this has to do with what we call the fortress mentality, or bad PR. Do not enter, you don't belong here. So corrections really don't have good PR. They're notorious for poor media and public relations forever. And there is a result of that fortress mentality, or this is the fortress you do not penetrate. So really, corrections personnel do not provide a lot of information to the media, and they are heavily restricted by supervisors in doing so, as potentially compromising security. You also get a lot of blocked access to inmates and staff. So for example, as a criminology major, have you ever gotten to tour a prison or jail? If you have, you're very lucky. I've taken my students on many tours of prisons and jails. I've probably visited about 15 to 18 different prisons and jails. And they can be very difficult to arrange tours for. And then you hope that there isn't a lockdown that happens once you get there. So it's very hard to get access to it. You also have a lot of withholding of information, and again, that can also not only be the prison staff themselves, but sometimes it has to do with the courts and the prosecutor or law enforcement worrying about witness intimidation or influence by other people on inmate behavior. And you also have things like stonewalling in times of crisis where very limited releases are made. So this entire lack of communication by the correctional staff really does drive a higher media influence. So basically, if I don't have much access to you, then I can spin whatever story I want about you. And that's exactly what has happened with corrections and the media. So basically, the public image of corrections was created by the media. The media played a very strong role in shaping the public image of corrections. And the media does claim a lot of accuracy about this portrayal, and actually more accuracy than about almost any other part of the criminal justice system. However, these portrayals tend to be more inaccurate once we have people that have gained access to the correctional system and they put them side by side with media depictions. They go, hey, nope, I cry foul. This really is not very accurate. So unfortunately, people that have access because maybe they have a friend or a family member or they have a job that requires them to have access to prison or jail, they'll tell you, we don't sit and beat the inmates like a lot of films say. In fact, we take very good care of them. They have lots of rights. It is a challenging environment to be in. However, it varies by security level, it varies by inmate, and it varies by institution. So with all the variation, you can't really use one or another. There are documentaries out there that document prison, but again, you have to also remember that those are heavily edited for the most dramatic moments that happen in a prison, which most moments are pretty mundane and boring to watch, so those are not going to be included in the depiction. The other problem you run into is those who shape public policy have also historically had very little knowledge of corrections. And you can see this in some films that I've used in class where suddenly politicians become aware of the treatment of inmates while incarcerated, and they're just appalled by it. And there becomes a public outcry, but it's like it was secret for many, many years. And, you know, there weren't very many advocates trying to make this known. So that's why we get into these loops of not knowing about it, then it becoming an atrocity, and then, you know, someone trying to bring forward a policy to fix it. But again, all in all, when you have low public knowledge about an institution, it generally gives you higher media influence to socially construct that image. So when we talk about prison media, you'll notice that mostly we're focused on television shows that might feature, you know, prison as part of the episode. Certainly news about jails and prisons. Again, the cycle of infotainment, print, and then prison films, very, very famous ones like The Shawshank Redemption. And interestingly enough, Shawshank Redemption is the highest rated film on the Internet Movie Database. It has a higher rating than any other film ever. And so if you haven't seen The Shawshank Redemption, I invite you to see it. But again, there are inaccuracies even in that film as well, as I'm sure many of my students who have worked in prison and jail can tell you. But I want to try to put forward some truth. So because I can't take you to a prison or jail and show you some of the history, I want to kind of show you a mini tour of Eastern State Penitentiary that will hopefully give you some of that historical foundation that you may or may not have. If you've taken a corrections class, hopefully you had a good chance to talk about Eastern State Penitentiary, but if not, you'll enjoy this mini tour. I'm going to do a very rapid tour of Eastern State Penitentiary. The reason why this matters is this is the very first penitentiary in the United States, and I got to visit it in person, take photos, get some of the history, and now you can start to see the fortress mentality playing out, as well as some of why things are so locked down. But this is the city of Philadelphia in the background of Eastern State Penitentiary. And look at the years operational, 1829 to 1971. This covers much of the time period that we look at in this course, from around the 1830s to the present day when media became really sophisticated. So again, very rapid tour, but for your benefit. So again, at its completion, the building was the largest and most expensive public structure ever erected in the United States. It quickly became a model for more than 300 prisons around the world. So this is what it looked like in 1829 when it was designed, kind of a central hub with all these spokes coming out the sides. And you literally see the fortress mentality in the design, looking like a castle with really high walls that cannot be penetrated. So here's a 19th century photo of the corridors. This is what the central hub would have looked like. And if you didn't know any better, you'd think this was a really nice ballroom. And you'll start to see why it took this shape and form a little bit later. But these were the actual cells. So in the 1890s, that's when this photo was taken, guards brought inmates meals with food carts. And you see a food cart in the middle of the hallway there. Inmates were really not allowed to eat together until 1924 because penitentiary meant a time of solace and penitence where you have to repent of your sins. And so basically you were in solitary confinement for most of the day. And all these little doors would slide open on these railings here. Interestingly, the building actually did have running water and flushing toilets before the White House did in the 1820s. So the joke was the inmates are getting better treatment than the president. But this was kind of the typical cell that you had, where you had a little door where you could go outside into a courtyard and maybe even grow a garden or work on your trade if you wanted to. Here's an up-close view of the toilets as they changed from the 1820s into more modern toilets, but essentially they were a concrete block that you would sit on with kind of a flusher attached to the wall, as the prison was still open and running in the 1950s through the 1970s. Eastern State was a place of solitude and penitence. Inmates were hooded to remain anonymous from each other, which is kind of creepy, and they would only reveal their identity when being moved from their cell. This was my tour guide, and my tour guide told us about the Philadelphia Society for Alleviating the Miseries of Public Prisons. So this goes back to our lecture where we're talking about how public officials are not very aware of what's going on in a prison, and between letters and communications, they start to discover some of these atrocities. So you may recognize one of the figures on there as Benjamin Franklin. He was one of the reformers of the Philadelphia Society to say, we need a penitentiary. So here was the original cell block design. So this is like cutting through the cell. Underneath, you actually see the sewer duct, which dealt with our toilets and water. You have the corridor, and then certainly the bed where the inmates slept, and then the courtyard outside of the cell where they could go get some sunshine. The cells also had a skylight above, which was kind of seen as the eye of God, looking down on you, judging you. You see the inmate hooded in this picture. This was the front part of Eastern State Penitentiary, again, the fortress, looking very castle-like back in its day. So punishments moved away from their religious origins of needing to repent and be alone into more modern tortures. So again, there was the water bath in which inmates were dunked and then hung out on a wall in winter until ice actually formed on their skin. We don't do this kind of stuff anymore, but it was practiced back at that time. That would be much more media-centric than just sitting in a cell. And then certainly you had the mad chair, which actually bound an inmate so tightly that circulation was cut off, later necessitating amputations. So that's kind of scary. But yeah, there were all kinds of atrocities that were very much hidden from public view over time. Another one you had was the iron gag, in which an inmate's hands were tied behind the back and strapped to an iron collar in the mouth, so that any movements of the tongue or teeth or jaw would tear the tongue and bleed profusely. So again, these were things that happened historically in prisons and jails, the grand experiment, which thankfully ended and was very scary. The use of hoods was discontinued at one point in time, and a convict's identity was no longer private. You see that the number of the inmate ID across the chest in these mugshots. And then, despite some of those torturous punishments, inmates were also granted some privileges. You see more reforms coming forward, like being able to go to church together, again, returning to that penitent theme that you saw earlier. But eventually, as Philadelphia grew into a modern city, the prison had to change and build new corridors. So you look at this prison, which at the time was built very far away from the city center, but now you see a place that has swimming pools and rec centers and schools and housing kind of all outside that city block. And lots of things being added on to the actual original design. So you see all these little add-ons, which is kind of funny. So this is what the prison looks like today. Again, a huge 30-foot wall surrounding the entire outside, blocking all public access, including media, to get inside. But this is essentially what Eastern State Penitentiary looks like today. It's a tourist place where you can go visit this historical prison. It is not used as a prison anymore. It's still a very castle-like fortress with the 30-foot walls. This is what it looks like in the interior yard when I toured there, which at one point housed a baseball field for inmates to play baseball during rec time. This is what the corridors look like today. You can see many of the doors are off their hinges and they're just kind of laying against the wall. There was plaster of Paris used. And again, it was supposed to look very church-like to include that penitence, okay, with skylights again being the eye of God. This is what a cell looks like today. It's highly deteriorated. But for the period of the 1820s, it would have actually been quite luxurious. And this was where criticisms would come from politicians when media did reveal the conditions, saying, hey, well, that looks like a really nice place to stay if you're homeless or if you're poor, so maybe you'll commit a crime to get nice accommodations. The skylight, again, was meant to be that eye of God, but this actually shows you my colleague who gave you a chance to see how spacious it was. He is about 6'4", and showed you his wingspan to show you the width of the cell. So it actually was somewhat spacious compared to modern cells of today. This is Corridor 10, where you can see, again, some deterioration, but a lot of the institution still remains intact. But you can imagine being a reporter trying to get access to this place. Absolutely not. You would not see it. This is another corridor that you can also see. Again, lots of years of repainting and so forth. To accommodate more inmates, eventually including female inmates, a double-decker style of cells was added. And yes, this prison was co-ed. So women were on one level and men were on the other. And there's another photo here. You can see one woman was so frustrated with the cold floors of her cell, she actually knitted carpet to cover everything in her cell so she could not have cold feet all the time. So they actually preserved what she did and used it as an exhibit. So this also shows you the double-decker style of the cells, having 2 levels now. Again, looking very deteriorated, but at the time was kind of cool. Lots of mirrors were installed in this prison so we could see what was going on at all times as a security feature during different corridors and so forth. But again, media access was very limited. This is the central block today, the hub where all the corridors meet in the courtyard. So there's hallway 6, corridor or hallway 5, and you can actually walk through these corridors one at a time if you'd like. Very famous inmate that stayed at Eastern State Penitentiary was Al Capone, and this was Al Capone's cell. So he had very lavish accommodations, mostly due to bribing the guards, and was running his business from his cell for a brief period of time. So again, no media access. This was all discovered much later. In a closed environment, lots of things can happen that are inaccurate or crazy, and this was one of them. This was actually a hole that was made for an escape that happened at Eastern State, and I'll quickly share the story with you. So this was when media was given access to a prison. This was back in 1945. The Philadelphia Inquirer drew a little depiction of how the escape happened, how 12 convicts escaped by tunnel from Eastern State Penitentiary and basically dug their way underneath those 30-foot walls to actually get on the other side. And this is a guard discovering the hole that was just covered up by a panel that they would kind of chip away at over time. So this is when the prison was allowed to be photographed by media. And you can imagine people's reactions, oh, they have a desk lamp in there? You know, stuff like that. But essentially the escape looked like this. This was all through media coverage. 12 inmates joined the escape tunnel on the way to breakfast that morning and scattered into the neighborhood. Sutton was captured within minutes, 2 blocks from the penitentiary. He later claimed credit for the tunnel's design and construction. Clendinst was out for 3 hours. Russell was shot and captured when he walked into a police trap at the home of his former girlfriend. You always go to known people that they would likely visit if they escaped, and you just wait for them there and do kind of that surprise attack. James Grace returned to the penitentiary early in the morning of April 11th, rang the doorbell, and asked to be let in. He was hungry and cold, and all the escaped inmates were eventually recaptured. The prison staff filled the tunnel with ash from the prison incinerator, and everything else is history. So today, Eastern State is actually used for historical tours and a haunted house, which is the primary source of funding for its operation. You can imagine how much fun it would be to be in that haunted house. They are not allowed to depict actual inmates. They can be kind of fictitious inmates, but they can't use names or realities of people that actually stayed there out of respect for the inmates and their families. And occasionally, Eastern State is also used for wedding photography. And I say, notice the orange groom, inmate orange in that photo. They just like kind of the romantic architecture of the time. So essentially, this is, you know, your historic prison tour that only took a couple of minutes to do, but it starts to show you some of maybe why the fortress mentality was so present, what limited access media did have, and some of the ongoings that happened in the prison that were scary, silly, strange, abhorrent, and some of why the coverage gets so mixed up. I hope you enjoyed this mini tour of Eastern State and our introduction of media and corrections. We'll see you next time.